Good afternoon, and thank you very much for a very enjoyable afternoon's discussion already. I want to pick up on George's last remark, which is his forecast about the world of WTO, because that's what I decided I would pick out as the most important message that I have as a former commission official, now as a sort of amateur academic, I'd say, looking at our relationship with China. What I want to highlight is that this is not the easiest time for the United Kingdom to be looking for new friends in the trading world, as it leaves what I always like to call the most trade-friendly environment that is conceivable, or that has certainly ever been delivered up to now internationally, which is within the EU. As we look outside, what faces us? And I want to highlight two things. Firstly, that WTO itself is in a sense an organisation in crisis. It's gone through a lot of changes in the last 30 years, and it's not a very good place for the most developed economies in the world to decide on the rules which make the biggest difference to them. I'll develop that in a minute. And secondly, I think the UK government, which has not actually been directly responsible for trade negotiations now for 47 years, has maybe forgotten or not paying enough attention to some of the hard realities of trade negotiation. I want to mention 5 of those problems, and I hope that the government is thinking about them. So look, let's pick up the first one, which is the how WTO has evolved. When it began, and when it was set up by developed countries after the Second World War, the rules were designed by them to suit their own trade development. But of course, it's changed and become something quite different as developing countries have joined, and as the most powerful developing countries, China being the obvious example, have only recently joined in 2001. And they have very different priorities to the priorities of developed economies. And the result of that has been that it's been increasingly difficult within WTO over the last 30 years for the developed economies within Europe, the United States, or Japan to get agreement within WTO on international rules which suit their development, which address issues like trade in services, intellectual property protection, even investment, because these are the leading drivers of international trade for them, and developing countries don't want to hear about that before some of their own economic development has been guaranteed, and guaranteed through nationalism, protectionism, and certainly very cautious approach, for example, to trade and services. So we have one side of the club which doesn't agree on the agenda of the other. The situation is made worse by some of the leading players behaving badly. I mean, the obvious example is the United States under President Trump. His America First policy is clearly intended to destabilize organizations like WTO. He's withdrawn the US from a leadership role in that organization. He's withholding resources from it. He doesn't want its sort of internal arbitration procedure to work anymore. He's not nominating people to it. And as well as that, he's pulling out of negotiations of a multilateral kind in which America has been involved. The Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Atlantic Agreement on trade and investment, the negotiations for that. So America doesn't want to know about multilateralism. For him, trade is a power play between two countries, and that's the only way that it should develop. China, soon to be the world's biggest economy, as someone's already said, follows a similar China First approach, basically. Since it joined WTO, it hasn't taken on any other obligations. It doesn't want to hear too much about the opening up of sectors where it restricts access to its markets, public utilities, the services sector, all the ones in which we think we might have a competitive advantage. And as a result of all this internal tension, what kind of trade negotiations are going on? They're all bilateral or regional without the US or without China. And what is that leading to? It's leading to an enormous amount of work to be done by every country that wants a trade agreement with different partners. It's a mix of bilateral, regional discussions. Where do you get the resources from, the people who know about negotiation, to deal with all these negotiations going on? It's very difficult. How do you fit this massive program of negotiations into the calendar of your officials? And the net result is trade negotiations are much slower than they've been in the past. And now, the going rate for an international trade negotiation is 7 years, sometimes 10. It took Switzerland 7 years to get an agreement with China, basically giving everything to the Chinese that they wanted. The fact is that negotiations are no longer quick anywhere. Now the second part of my message, which is some of the hard realities of international negotiations, which maybe the UK has forgotten. And I've got 5, but I may, time, you can stop me if I haven't dealt with them in 4 minutes. The first is that the most important barriers to trade and cooperation are political. They're not like calculating tariffs, which is basically a quantitative approach. How much do I gain? How much have I got to give away for that? That can be done relatively quickly. The important trade barriers for developed economies are non-tariff barriers. We call them behind-the-border barriers, where you're talking about standards. We've already heard about food standards in the United States. You're talking about competition rules when it comes to closed sectors in your own economy, where you've got to open up to competition. Moving to common standards, opening up competition. That's not settled overnight. And the whole row about where do we go on agricultural subsidies, which is just some sort of policy made on the cuff by the current government, is simply running into the sand because people believe you can't make policy that way. So dealing with that is slow. And that's why when the EU developed this sophisticated environment for trade, it took 8 to 10 years to agree on all these regulations that were needed to remove some of these non-tariff barriers. Second big point, even your friends, even the people you imagine to be your closest partners, sometimes see things very differently from the way you do, and they're not easily persuaded to see it your way. Let's take the situation across the Atlantic. There are huge differences between the European attitudes towards foreign competition in the transport sector, for example, and the attitude of the United States, which restricts competition in airlines, sea transport, never mind rail and all the rest of it, enormously. Or the need for third-party intervention to check whether a product has been developed safely. We do things one way in Europe. The Americans have the opposite view for no apparent reason, except that's the way they've always done it. But trying to get Congress to change the way it thinks about issues like that, very, very difficult. And of course, when it comes to partners that are even further away, like China, China is absolutely immovable on the issue of getting more access to sectors where Europe thinks it may be competitive. Again, transport or financial services, energy, because it has a system that is based on party control of certain key sectors which affect the living standards of the Chinese people. And it is never going to give to a foreign supplier the opportunity of taking the praise, the kudos of doing things better than the party. This is an immovable object, and it's not going to change very quickly. Third point, every trade partner you have has a different agenda, its own agenda, and there's never going to be a perfect match. So when you want to talk to India about trade, India will say, well, of course, an important issue for us is free movement of our skilled workforce into your country so that we can acquire the skills, the know-how that we need to improve the quality of services and of skills in our economy. And that might not necessarily fit your priorities, so you're going to have to think about that. Similarly, of course, the US insistence on doing something in the agricultural food area to all its trade partners leads to difficulties and at the very least a slowing down of negotiations. And finally, I think I'll drop one of my don't forgets, but one that's already come up. Size really matters in trade negotiation. A bigger, more diversified market has more to offer its trade partners than one that's only strong in a few of those sectors. It also has more to play with in terms of offering different options to its trade partner to get what it wants. So a small economy has a great deal of difficulty. Firstly, getting the priority when China is planning the timetable of its trade negotiators. The UK is going to come much lower on the list than the EU. And I've already mentioned the Swiss example. Switzerland, absolutely keen on an agreement with China, took 7 years from the beginning of the negotiation to the delivery of the agreement to get an agreement which allows China to gradually dismantle its tariffs on Swiss exports over 10 years. But Switzerland must drop its tariffs straight away for the Chinese. So all of this adds up to a rather gloomy picture about the ability of this country on its own to get what it wants, to even get the people it wants to the table anytime soon. So I come back to my opening point that finding a new place for the United Kingdom in this unstable international trading environment can't be done easily. It's going to take ages whether we like it or not.